Welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker, and in today's video we're going to be talking about some NBA players that in my opinion should be traded this season, but probably won't be. Now every single member of this list is an all-star caliber player at this point in their career, so it's not so much about the fact that they don't have value in terms of why they probably won't be traded, but just that the teams won't be willing to move on from that particular player for a variety of reasons. And first up on the list now is a pretty common one, and that's Ben Simmons of the Philadelphia 76ers. And this has been something that has been talked about for probably a year and a half at this point. There were times last season when people were having this discussion, even as Ben Simmons was playing well. It was more about a fit issue with the rest of the team and how he fits alongside Joel Embiid. And I really think that Ben Simmons is an extremely talented player, but he's a player that you have to kind of build your team around to get the most out of. And you could argue that the team that they have in Philadelphia is probably as opposite of a team that you would want to build around Ben Simmons as you could possibly have, in terms of just not a ton of floor spacing, an inside post player that you need to feed the basketball, not playing in transition all that much. I think Ben Simmons is a player that definitely thrives in transition, getting out of the fast break, not playing in a half court so much, and when he is in a half court, working out of the post and in ball screens and driving to the rim because of his obvious issues with shooting the basketball from three-point range or even just outside of the paint in general. Now, many of those issues are his own, and they come down to, just for whatever reason, his complete unwillingness to either work on his jump shot or just shoot them in games. But that doesn't change the fact that, in my opinion, he needs to be somewhere other than Philadelphia. Now, I understand that even with all of that said, this Philadelphia 76ers team could still make the finals this year, and even though they've had some issues, they're sitting at 11-6 so far this season. But it's not so much about the results of their games. It's about when you watch them, he just doesn't seem to fit with the rest of this roster, which is disappointing, like I said, because I think he's talented. Just this roster doesn't fit what he does best. And at this point, they're too far invested in this group of Joel Embiid, now Horford and Josh Richardson and Tobias Harris, to move on from any of those players. And the logical one to move on from, in my opinion, is Ben Simmons, to get a more traditional point guard, to get more floor spacing on this team, and to kind of spread out some of the talent that they have across the rest of their roster by moving on from Ben Simmons. Now, that's I think they should trade him part, but it's more than likely that they're just not going to. Teams don't, quote unquote, give up on players of this caliber so quickly after drafting them first overall when their team is playing well. But I think it's fair to say that some players in that draft class that Ben Simmons was drafted in have surpassed him now in terms of his effectiveness on the court. I still think he's the most talented player from that class, but the problem is he's just not showing it productivity-wise in his current situation in Philadelphia, and I would love to see him traded. I really would. I would love to see him on a different team that allows him to play more to his style so we can properly evaluate how good of an NBA player he actually is, because I think right now if you're grading him, you kind of have to give him an incomplete based off some of the coaching issues with Brett Brown and how he kind of runs that team in terms of trying to maximize Ben Simmons specifically, in terms of their style of play, in terms of their personnel. So I would love to see him on a different team, but I think you guys can agree that it's pretty unlikely that that would actually happen, at least not for the next couple of years. And moving on now to two players, one of which was actually featured in the most recent NBA Trade Machine episode, and that's LaMarcus Aldridge and DeMar DeRozan of the San Antonio Spurs. So here's why I think that they should be traded. This team, even if they turn it around, they got off to, maybe one of the worst starts they've had in the last 10 or so years. Even if this team manages to turn it around and make the playoffs, this team isn't going anywhere as currently constructed. It doesn't really appear that they have a trade to make, or they're all that interested in making a trade to further bolster this team as like a potential championship contender. And they're not really gonna go any further than like 50 wins on a good season, and they're not going to be competing for championships. And it just seems like now would be the logical time, if it's ever going to quote unquote end for this run for the Spurs. Now seems like a good time. You have two valuable pieces on your team in LaMarcus Aldridge and DeMar DeRozan that teams would be interested in right now, and you have the opportunity to move on from those guys and start what could be a pretty quick rebuild, because you already have pieces like DeJounte Murray and Derek White on the team, along with some other young players as well. Now the problem is, as we all know, they're pretty unwilling to go into kind of a rebuilding phase by trading away one or both of those players because Greg Popovich is still the coach. And maybe they'll continue to try and run it back as long as he is there, but that would be a disservice to their franchise and to their fans in terms of long-term success. Because I think if they turned these pieces into something a little bit more focused on the long term, while Popovich is still there, they could really develop those players and be a good team within the next like 2 or 3 seasons, which is a pretty quick rebuild by today's NBA standards. But it seems like they're going to be pretty unwilling to do that. But both of these players are movable when you look at their contracts, when you look at how well they are still playing. It's not like these guys are 38 making $30 million a year. They're valuable players to teams around the league, and I wish they would move on. I wish they would pull the trigger, focus on the younger guys, get some assets moving forward, because there's plenty of teams this year that would be interested in these players with how wide open the championship chase looks to be, and maybe it'll seem more realistic the closer we get to the trade deadline if the Spurs continue to struggle. But right now, even with how poorly they're playing, it doesn't really seem like they're all that likely to move on from one or both of these players, even though I think that's what they probably should do. Next up now, in a similar kind of situation, is Blake Griffin and Andre Drummond of the Detroit Pistons, and you can even put Reggie Jackson on there as well. I'm thinking about potentially just doing like a Detroit Pistons trade machine video here coming up, because I think this is a team that needs to move on. Like, similar to the Spurs in terms of their situation this season, they could turn it around, Blake could get healthy, and they could, make the 7th or 8th seed in the playoffs, but that's not really doing them any good when they have players on their roster that they could trade to try and get some pieces. Now, the Drummond thing is a bit of an issue because he's a potential free agent this offseason, so teams might not be all that interested in trading for him, and Blake is coming off of some injury issues to begin this season. He's making a ton of money. He's getting older, but he had a really good season last year, and I think you could get something for these two players, and then Reggie Jackson as an expiring contract in there as well. And the situation that the Pistons find themselves in, and to a lesser extent the Spurs, is exactly where you don't want to be in the NBA, because they're going to continue to fill up their roster with draft picks from like the 10 to the 15 range in the first round, and you're just more than likely not going to be finding all-star, all-NBA caliber players in that range, with very few exceptions, guys like Donovan Mitchell, Giannis Antetokounmpo over the last few years. For the most part, you're going to be getting the Luke Kennards of the world that could end up being quality players, starting caliber players, but they're not going to be franchise-altering guys. So if you don't already have those players on your roster, players that can be the top 1 or 2 guys on a championship team, then you need to make moves to try and get them. And whether that's accumulating assets to make a star trade down the road, like the Rockets did with James Harden back in the day, or that's just quote-unquote tanking, as many teams do, to get to the top of the draft order and then try and get a franchise-altering player there. That's a situation I think the Pistons find themselves in, and I really wish that they would just pull the trigger. Like, it doesn't make any sense to continue to go for the 7 or 8 seed. I'm sure if you ask Pistons fans, they would be saying the same thing, that they need to hold on to the younger players that actually look like they're going to be something down the road, and they need to move on from this era. It was nice for them to make the playoffs a couple of times. Blake Griffin had a really good season last year, but there's almost no scenario in which this team gets like a top 5 seed in the Eastern Conference at any point over the next couple of years, and at some point pushes for championship contention with the way that this roster is currently constructed. So trading Andre Drummond, trading Blake Griffin, again, there are teams around the league that would be interested in those players. The Celtics are a team that comes to mind that needs some front court help, that could be interested in moving some pieces. There are plenty of teams around the league that would say, hey, Blake Griffin would be a nice addition, Andre Drummond would be a nice addition, and I wish that the Pistons would pull the trigger. But again, I don't really think that they're going to do that, because they seem really invested in making the playoffs every single year. Now that they've got Dwayne Casey and they've got some pieces that could work well together, it just doesn't seem like they're all that interested in giving up on that dream of just constantly being a playoff team, which has certain benefits in terms of keeping fan interest up and keeping ticket sales up, in terms of just not being a completely awful team. But if you're looking at the long term and you're looking at actually being a top level team in the NBA at some point, that's just not the right path. And so I wish they would trade them, but I don't think it's going to happen, at least not this season. And then the next members of the list, it's a similar theme. It's Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum. And this one I've kind of brought up for parts of the last year and a half. And every time I bring it up, people say in the comment section that there's no way that Portland would move either of these two guys, because they're so invested in them, they're so loyal. That's part of what makes their franchise great, and the fans are really loyal to these two guys. And that's a really noble thing and really unique. Like, when I come up with trade ideas or I talk about players potentially being traded, those two guys get defended more so than pretty much any other two players in the league by their own fan base in terms of like, don't trade them away. But when you're just taking a step back from all that stuff and looking at it objectively, they need to move on from what they've been trying to do for the last 4 or so years with this combination. At least based off the way their roster is currently constructed, they just don't have the pieces around these guys to potentially make a championship run. And I thought coming into the season that maybe because they had a move to make, like they had the Hassan Whiteside expiring contract, maybe they could get a good wing or a front court player like Kevin Love. Nurkic would come back. They would have Lillard and McCollum, and they'd be able to figure it out from there, but that just hasn't been the case. And I think that this is an ideal time to maybe not completely rebuild by trading both of them, but look into trading at least one of them to at least reconfigure the rest of the roster, because I think Damian Lillard is outstanding and continually doesn't get enough credit for how good he is. And CJ McCollum is probably the guy that I would look to try and trade to kind of move some of that talent that he has across the rest of the roster to make a more balanced roster, put Anthony Simons more in a starting role, taking over a lot of the McCollum stuff, and then just get a really good wing or a front court player. I wish that would be the case. Like, I'm not necessarily advocating for them to trade away both of these guys and go into complete rebuild mode, just because I don't think that you'd be able to make the salaries work, and I don't know that they would get enough value to really justify that decision. But it would still be a pretty solid idea, in my opinion, to attempt to space out some of this talent across the rest of the roster by trading away someone like CJ McCollum and just seeing what their team would look like with these two guys broken up. Like, I understand that they've had success. They made a Western Conference Finals last year with these two guys, but it's worth at least thinking about trying something different just for the sake of seeing if it would work. You know what the Lillard-McCollum thing looks like, and you know it can be successful, but it's not happening right now unless you get a really good wing on this team, and it doesn't really look like that's a big possibility for them unless they trade someone like CJ McCollum. So I would hope that that would be the case, but again, this is a team that is notoriously loyal to those two players and a fan base that is really loyal to those two guys, and they probably just don't want to upset the fan base by trading away one of them, even though basketball-wise, it's probably the right decision. And the last up on the list is another player that has been in an NBA trade machine video recently, and that is Draymond Green. And the reason why I think they should is simply because his value is never going to be higher than it is right now. Not that he's playing out of his mind or anything right now, but he's going to continue to go downhill in terms of his production on the court. And when you combine that with some of the contract stuff, he's never going to be more valuable than he is in this moment in terms of a potential trade. And so I just wish that they would capitalize on that and make this team as good as possible over the next couple of seasons, because this isn't like a rebuild thing. Like, they're going to have Steph back, they're going to have Clay back next year. D'Lo is probably still going to be there unless they trade him, which would be a surprise to me. And if they were able to move on from Draymond and get picks or a couple of good wings or just whatever they could possibly get, I think that would make their team even better next year. And I understand the argument of, well, if they keep Draymond, they've got those three guys and they've got D'Lo. When they're all healthy next year, they're going to be one of the best teams in the West. But I think they would be better if they trade away Draymond at this point, because he's only going to get worse, and their ability to trade him is only going to decrease the worse and worse that he plays. And this would be such a more interesting Golden State team to me moving forward if they moved on from him. And I think there are teams that could certainly use him this year as well that would be interested in him, and that would make it a little bit more interesting this year as well in terms of the championship chase. Now, having said that, I don't think there's any way that they actually trade him because they're loyal to him. He's one of the few guys that is actually healthy on this roster right now that is kind of helping these young guys through what's going to be a really, really tough season for them. So I get why they won't do it, but just like kind of the whole theme of this list, I wish that they would. And there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.